Welcome to our Temporary Access Application tutorial series for K2 Studio. In this tutorial, we will teach you how to build workflows and smart objects using K2 Studio. The sample scenario for this tutorial is a temporary access application where employees can request temporary access to the premises and systems of an organization. For example, think of contractors or consultants when they visit. They come on site and they need some kind of system access or security access for the duration of their visit. It is a type of onboarding and offboarding application where systems and humans work together to make sure that resources are in place before someone starts and that the necessary steps are performed once those users have left the organization to revoke access. The primary driver for this application is security and auditing. This is so that any access to the organization is approved and so that it is easy for anyone in the organization to see who is allowed to be on the premises and who to contact with questions about access. As part of this, certain automatic actions will be applied by the workflow to terminate access at specific dates, that is, if no user overrides have occurred. This tutorial can be completed in any environment that has K2 version 4.6.9 or later installed. K2 delivered training events normally include access to a virtual server environment provided by K2, which you will use for the exercises. The screenshots and users used in the tutorial reflect this K2 provided virtual environment when you're looking at it. You can, however, complete this tutorial in any other environment as long as the necessary K2 components are installed and operational. Again, that being K2 version 4.6.9 or later. With that in mind, you must also have the necessary rights and permissions to create the K2 artifacts in the target environment. Since this tutorial focuses on workflows and smart objects built with K2 Studio, we will be providing a starter project that contains the basic smart objects and smart forms used for the application. The sections in this tutorial are designed to help you become familiar with K2 Studio and to teach you how to build workflows and smart objects with that tool. In parts 1 and 2, we will build the workflow component of the temporary access application. We will be using K2 Studio to build the workflow, and you will get the chance to learn about some more advanced workflow concepts like conditional lines, evaluating user data and business data in a line, escalations, loopback lines, and more. You will also become familiar with the K2 Studio workflow design environment, and you will get to learn how to format workflows for clarity. Part 3 will set up a series of test records to run through all the possible paths the workflow can take after building out the workflow in the first two sections. Then, in Part 4, we will create a composite smart object using K2 Studio that will combine data from the workflow reporting service with data from the K2 Smartbox service that is tied to the input form in the application. In effect, we are going to combine workflow reporting data with business data to build a report that is relevant to our users so that our users can easily see which temporary access authorizations are in effect and what the workflow status is. Before building our application, it's important to understand what we want to achieve by designing the necessary pieces. Let's start with the design of the workflow component. As we walk through the diagram, it shows the conceptual flow of the temporary access application workflow. We've laid out our flowchart in a swim lane format where we have separated the user tasks and system tasks into separate lanes. You should notice that the user tasks have been highlighted in a light blue color for clarity and reading purposes. In looking more in depth at the design of our workflow, a user submits a new temporary access request, which is routed to their manager for approval. The access request includes information like the temporary user's name and company, the start date and end date of the request, whether an Active Directory account should be created for the user, and whether there are additional IT and HR tasks for the request. If the request is rejected, the system will set the access request status to rejected and then email the originator. If the request is approved, the system will determine whether a new Active Directory user account was requested for the temporary user. Let's talk about that path of the workflow for a moment. If an account was requested, the system will automatically create a new Active Directory account for the temporary user upon approval. Once this is done, the workflow will mark the status of the request as approved. Note that it will also mark this status if no account was requested. Then K2 will determine whether there were additional IT tasks and/or HR tasks required and route the workflow accordingly. For example, perhaps access to additional systems need to be granted by IT, paperwork for HR needs to be reviewed, or a security badge for access to the front gate needs to be created. Note that if both IT and HR tasks are selected, the workflow will actually split into a parallel execution mode. This is because there is no reason for IT to wait on HR or vice versa in this scenario. Once the required tasks are completed, or if there are no additional HR or IT tasks requested, the workflow will wait until the day before the temporary access end date is reached. Then, the requester must decide whether or not to extend the access for the temporary user. If access is extended, the workflow will loop back to the extended access step and wait there until the day before the new end date. This loopback is available as long as the originator requires that the access be extended. If the originator selects the Do Not Extend Access option, the system will set the access request status to expired, and if an account was created for the temporary user, it will automatically disable that account. As a security measure, we will also tell the workflow to expire the Extend Access step 1 day after the end date. This is in case the originator does not complete their task at that point in time. In this case, the workflow will automatically set the access request status to expired, and if necessary, it will disable the Active Directory user account for the temporary user. Let's take a look at the conceptual design of the workflow. From a learning perspective, this workflow contains a number of interesting paths, including conditional lines, evaluation of user decisions, along with business data. It has activities that loop back on themselves, parallel execution, escalations, and it pauses on the start of certain activities until a particular date is reached. Now that you have a grasp of the basic flow of the workflow, let's take a look at the forms that will be used in the application. This application will consist of a single K2 Smart Form-based form that is used to capture and display the temporary access request information. Behind the scenes, this form has logic built in that will check the current workflow step, and then it will selectively disable and hide certain sections of the form that are not applicable for the current user. Since this tutorial focuses mainly on workflows and smart objects, we won't need to be as concerned with the behavior and rules behind this form. Just understand that the data is being captured and displayed on the form, and that the workflow will behave differently based on the data captured on the form. For our data design, this application is going to require 3 smart objects for its data components. The Temporary Access Request Active Directory User Smart Object is going to be used to automatically populate fields on the form and to save the requester and the approver details into the Temporary Access Request Smart Object. The Temporary Access Request Smart Object is the primary smart object for this application, and it stores all of the data that will be captured for a temporary access request off the form. This data is going to be displayed on the form, and it's going to be used by the workflow. Finally, the Temporary Access Request Composite Smart Object will be used to build a report of temporary access request data along with workflow reporting data. We will be building this smart object in part 4 of this tutorial as it pertains to the report design requirement of the application. Let's look at the report design at this point. In this application, we are going to create a single report which lists all the temporary access request records in the system. What makes this report interesting is that we will create a composite smart object which will combine the data from the workflow reporting service with data from the K2 Smart Objects service. Again, in effect, we are going to combine workflow reporting data with business data to build a report that is relevant to our users. In this case, we want to create a view of temporary access requests that anyone in the organization can review at any time, along with the workflow status and a link to the workflow as it unfolds within K2. This is a security measure so that it is easy to see who is allowed to access the premises and so that it is easy to track down a workflow if it is stuck at a user task or to identify if the workflow failed. To achieve this, we will build a composite smart object in K2 Studio, build a view against the smart object, and then add the view to our temporary access request form. From a learning perspective, the important point in this part of the tutorial will be how to build an advanced smart object that combines data from different services. While we are using K2 services for this example, the principles apply equally to other smart objects as well. You can use the same approach to build a smart object that, for example, combines data from your HR SQL database with your Active Directory system to build a logical employee smart object. Moving into the building of the application, now that we have explained the designs for each of the components, those being the workflow, data, forms, and reports, we are ready to begin building the workflow and report elements of this application. Again, because this tutorial focuses on workflows and smart objects with K2 Studio, we have provided a starter project with the forms and the majority of the data elements already created for you. We will only focus on the workflow and the composite smart object for this tutorial just to speed things up. The starter project will be downloaded in part 1 of the tutorial, and you will have the chance to learn how to deploy it using the K2 package and deployment utility provided by K2 upon installation of the platform. When you're ready to start building the application, continue on to part 1, building a workflow with K2 Studio to get started.